The carriage door had not yet closed when she heard him laugh, and the laugh was not for her. It was the kind of laugh a man offered a woman he wished to flatter, low and indulgent, shaped to be overheard. Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Marchcombe, stood on the gravel of her own forecourt in a cloak the color of wet slate and counted, without meaning to, the seconds between that laugh and the moment the door of the second carriage swung shut behind it. 4 seconds in which a footman pretended to study his gloves, in which a groom pretended to study a buckle, in which the night pretended to study the sky. She had a few seconds to decide what kind of woman she would be tonight, and she chose, as she had chosen 100 small times before, to be the kind who did not flinch. She lifted the hem of the slate cloak. She did not look at the second carriage. She walked. The gravel made the same sound under her slippers as it had made under her father's boots when she was 9 years old, and learning, even then, that a house could be a kind of theater, and that the trick of surviving it was to remember always which side of the curtain you stood on. Behind her, the laugh came again, softer this time, gathered up and tucked away, the way one tucks away a love letter one does not yet wish to be caught reading. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. He never did, anymore. The steward at the door of Marchcombe House bowed as if nothing in the world were unusual, because that was his particular art, and she thanked him without raising her voice, because that was hers. Inside, the hall smelled of beeswax and old roses and the faint ironwork chill of a house that had been polished to within an inch of its dignity for an occasion she alone in all of it truly understood. Tonight, the king would open the royal ball at the Palace of Astron in honor of the patron whose endowment had restored its eastern wing, whose foundation had quietly fed the hospital on Drover Lane through 2 hard winters, whose anonymous donations had bought instruments for the orphan choir and salt for the fishermen of the lower coast. Tonight, the king would publicly name that patron. Tonight, every soul in the kingdom of any standing would learn the identity of the heiress of Lyon, whose ledger had for 7 years kept half the city alive without asking to be thanked. Eleanor climbed the staircase with the calm of a woman who knew exactly which step creaked and did not step on it. She had 2 hours. She had perhaps less. She had the rest of her life, depending on how the next 2 hours went. In her dressing room, a single candle burned on the table beside a small velvet box. Inside the box, on a bed of cream silk, lay a thin gold key. It was not ornamental. It opened a strong box in a counting house on Carrick Street. She closed the box. She closed it gently, the way one closes the door of a sleeping child's room. From the courtyard below, faint through 2 sets of windows, came her husband's voice, then the answering voice, light and amused, of the woman he had brought home from London a fortnight ago and installed, with a casualness that had impressed even the housekeeper, in the south apartments. Lady Cassia Vale. A name like a curtain, a name like a small polished bell. The woman herself was, Eleanora had been forced to admit, beautiful in the way certain orchids are beautiful, deliberate and faintly threatening, and she had a laugh that fitted a man's pocket. Tonight, Sebastian, Duke of Marchcombe, would escort that laugh to the royal ball on his arm. He had told Eleanora so, over breakfast, with the elaborate kindness men reserve for the announcements they expect to wound. He had said the word duty as if it were a coat he was lending her. He had said the words public interest as if they were a cup of tea. He had not said the word wife. Eleanora had buttered her toast. She had asked if he preferred the carriage with the new wheel or the old. She had agreed, in a tone he mistook for resignation, that there would be a great many people of importance present and that one ought not to make a scene. She had not corrected him on a single word of it. Now, in the candlelight, she lifted from its stand a gown the color of deep river stone, gray that turned, when it moved, to the faintest silver, with a single seam of pale gold along the bodice, so fine that across a ballroom it would read as a line of light. It was not the gown a woman wore to be noticed. It was the gown a woman wore to be recognized by those who had reason to know what to look for. She had chosen it 3 weeks ago. She had not chosen it tonight. The maid, Tibby, came in without being called and without speaking, because Tibby had been with her since the country house, and had long ago learned that there were evenings when speech was a kind of trespass. Tibby's hands moved in the small, accurate way of a person who had been doing the same set of motions for nearly 2 decades. And Eleanora let herself stand inside those hands the way one stands inside a familiar weather. Hooks, laces, the faint tug at the small of the back that meant the bodice was true. A breath, another breath. The hair, which was the color of dark honey when the candle caught it, and brown otherwise, was lifted, twisted, pinned, and finished with a single comb of pale ivory that had belonged to Eleanora's mother, and had, on the back of it, in a hand so worn it could no longer be read by strangers, the 2 initials L.V. Lion, Vane, the maiden name and the married, the ledger and the man. Tibby set the comb. Tibby stepped back. Tibby looked only once directly into her mistress's face in the mirror and said, in a voice no louder than the candle, "You will eat something before we leave this house, my lady, or you will faint on the king's marble and shame the kitchen." Eleanora laughed. It was the first true sound she had made all day. She let Tibby bring her broth in a small painted bowl, and she drank it standing up, because to sit in this gown was to crease it, and because she was not tonight the kind of woman who sat. From the courtyard a hoof rang on stone. A horse shifted. Somewhere below, in the small parlor, a clock she had wound herself 2 evenings ago struck the quarter, and she counted under her breath. 7 hours until dawn. 3 hours until the king would speak. 1 hour, perhaps, until the carriage was called. She had time. She would not waste it on grief. Grief, she had learned, was a debt one paid in installments, and tonight was not the night to make a payment. She crossed the dressing room to a small writing desk, opened the lap drawer, and drew from beneath a stack of unimportant correspondence, a folded sheet of cream paper sealed in plain wax. It was addressed in her own hand to a Mr. Halloran of Carrick Street. Inside it were 3 short instructions, each of them lawful, each of them quiet, each of them irrevocable. She held the letter for a moment, as a swimmer holds a breath before going under. Then she slid it into the small embroidered reticule that would hang from her wrist. She did not look at it again. She did not need to. She had written it herself in the small hours, in a hand so steady that even she had wondered, afterwards, whose hand it had been. From the south apartments, very faintly, she heard the rustle of a different gown, the murmur of Lady Cassia's maid praising something, the soft answering laugh, lower than a public laugh, more sure of itself. Eleanora paused at the window. She looked, not out at the courtyard, but up at the line where the eaves of Marchcombe House met the first stars. She had grown up under those stars. She had been brought to this house at 19 with a dowry that had startled the city, and a husband who had kissed her hand at the altar with what she had then mistaken for tenderness, and now understood to have been relief. She had been a wealthy stranger to him, and then the convenience of a wealthy stranger, and then, by degrees so small that even she could not date them, an inconvenience. He had never been cruel. He had only, over the course of 7 years, stopped seeing her. There was, she thought, a particular grief to that which the language did not yet have a word for. Being unloved was one thing. Being unwatched was another. Tibby cleared her throat at the door. The carriage was ready. The Duke had already gone down. The Lady Cassia was, the steward reported with the perfect tone of a man reporting the weather, in the second carriage. There would be 2 carriages then. The Duchess of Marchcombe would arrive alone. Eleanora set her shoulders, the way her father had taught her to set them, across a table from a man twice her age and 3 times her experience. She lifted her chin only as much as she needed to. She walked out of the dressing room without looking back at the candle. On the stairs, she met no one. In the hall, the steward bowed again. In the courtyard, the groom held the door of the carriage open with his eyes carefully on the lamp, and she stepped into the dark of the seat without taking the hand he offered, because a hand offered out of pity was a worse insult than a hand withheld. The door closed. The horses moved. The carriage rolled out under the gate of Marchcombe House and into the long, slow avenue toward the palace of Astron, where, by the time the night was done, a great many things would be true that had not been true at sunset. The road to Astron ran beside the river for nearly a mile, and Eleanora let the river do the work the conversation could not. She watched it through the carriage window, the slow black of it broken by the gold of the bridge lamps, and she thought about the year she was 12, when her father had set her on a stool beside his desk and taught her to read a ledger before he taught her to dance. He had said, not unkindly, that a woman who could not read a ledger would be read by one. He had said that money was only language. He had said, and this she remembered most clearly, that the world would always tell her she did not understand a thing in order to take it from her, and that the only protection was to understand it twice as well as the men who said so, and to never, ever say that she did. She had been a good student. She had been, in the end, a better merchant than her father, although she had never told him so, and he had died before he could find out. The fortune of the House of Lyon had passed to her at 20, the year before her marriage, and she had quietly tripled it in the 7 years since. She had done so under 3 different names, through 6 different brokers, with a careful hand and a colder head than anyone in the city would have believed her capable of. And she had given away, in the same 7 years, more than half of what she earned. She had done this without telling her husband. She had done this, in fact, because she did not tell her husband. She had learned within a month of the wedding that he would have spent it, and within a year that he would have spent her with it. And by the end of the 2nd year, she had understood that the kindest thing she could do for them both was to let him believe he had married a pleasant, decorative, slightly tedious heiress whose money was managed by men in offices he did not need to visit. She had let him believe it. He had been grateful, in the way men are grateful for things they have decided not to look at. He had stopped asking. He had started, instead, to drift. There had been, over the years, a small succession of women, whose names she had learned from laundresses and dismissed from her mind. Lady Cassia was the first he had brought into the house. That had been, Eleanora thought as the river slid past, an interesting decision. It had told her something. It had told her that he believed himself untouchable, and that he believed her, finally and fully, beneath embarrassment. She found, examining the thought as one examines a bruise, that she was not angry. She was something colder and more useful than anger. She was decided. The carriage turned away from the river and climbed the long, slow rise toward the palace, and she could see, over the shoulder of the coachman, the lights of Astron beginning to gather above the trees. A low, warm constellation that grew, as they approached, into a city of windows. The Palace of Astron was the oldest building in the kingdom that still housed a living court. Its eastern wing had stood half-ruined for 30 years until a patron, 2 summers ago, had quietly paid for its restoration on the single condition that no plaque be raised and no name be carved. The king, who was a curious man and a stubborn one, had spent the better part of a year tracing the gift to its source. He had succeeded only because the heiress of Lyon had at last allowed him to. She had allowed him to because she had grown tired of being a rumor in her own life. She had allowed him to because she had calculated, with the precision of a woman who calculated everything, that the moment of being named would be the only moment in which she could do certain things that needed doing and could not be undone afterwards by a husband who had grown comfortable with her invisibility. She had allowed him to because she was, although she would not have used the word aloud, ready. The carriage drew up at the eastern gate, where the new stone was paler than the old, and the carvings, fresh, showed a vine her own grandmother had loved. She stepped down without help. The footman bowed lower than he needed to. The herald at the gate took her name and did not say it aloud, which was, she understood, a courtesy arranged in advance by someone who knew tonight's choreography better than she had assumed anyone would. She was led, not through the public stair, but along a quieter passage, lit by lamps in glass the color of weak tea, to a small antechamber where a single man waited. He was not tall, he was not young. He had a face that had been kind for so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. And he wore the dark green coat of the king's personal household. He bowed. He said, "My Lady of Lyon, the king sends his compliments and asks whether you will permit him to speak with you for the length of a single glass of water before the doors are opened." She inclined her head. She said, "Of the two of us, the king is the one who has been kept waiting longer." He smiled. He led her through a low door into a smaller room, where a tall man with tired eyes and a plain coat was standing at a window. And the tall man turned, and she curtsied to the depth required, and he lifted her up from it with a hand that was warm and a little rough, and said without preamble, "I have wanted to thank you in person for 4 years, madam, and I have been forbidden to do so by your own letters." She said, "Then it is fortunate, your majesty, that tonight even my letters cannot stop you." He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, the laugh of a man who did not waste them. He gestured her to a chair, and he sat opposite her, and for the length of a glass of water that neither of them drank, they spoke. He asked after the orphan choir on Drover Lane. She told him the eldest of the boys had been apprenticed to a printer and had set the type for his own first hymn, which had made the printer cry. He asked after the hospital. She told him the matron had been overruled at last in the matter of the second well, and there would be clean water by spring. He asked, in a tone so careful she almost missed it, whether there was anything tonight that he could do for her that she had not already arranged for herself. She looked at him. She said, "Your Majesty, I would ask only that when you speak my name, you speak it as my father's daughter, and not as anyone's wife." He held her eyes. He said, "Madam, I had not intended to do otherwise." She rose. He rose. He offered his arm at the door, which was a courtesy he did not need to offer, and which she did not need to accept, and they walked together to the threshold of the great gallery, where she released his arm and stepped back into shadow. Because the entrance, by long custom and by tonight's particular design, would be made not on the king's arm, but on her own. The great gallery of Astron was the length of 3 streets and the height of a small forest, and tonight it was full. Eleonora paused in the shadow of the inner door and let her eyes adjust to the light, which was the light of 900 candles and as many small flames in the cut glass of the chandeliers, and to the sound, which was the soft, enormous murmur of 1,000 people pretending not to be excited. She found, without looking for it, the place where her husband stood. He stood near the second fireplace, beneath the painting of the old queen, with Lady Cassia on his arm in a gown the color of pomegranate. He was laughing again, although more softly here, because even he understood that one did not laugh in this room the way one laughed in a courtyard. Cassia was beautiful. Eleanora granted it. The gown was bold, and the throat was bare, and the chin was tilted at exactly the angle a portraitist would have asked for. And around them, a small, loose circle of acquaintance had formed, which was the particular respect men paid to a woman they intended to gossip about later. Eleanora watched for perhaps 3 breaths. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She felt instead a strange, distant tenderness for the woman in the pomegranate gown, who did not yet know that she was standing inside someone else's evening. The herald drew breath. The herald spoke. The hall did not, at first, understand. The name he gave was not the name they had expected to hear next, and there was a small ripple, the kind of ripple a room makes when it is recalibrating. And then the name was understood, and then the silence began. The silence began at the great doors and moved outward in a slow, careful tide, conversation by conversation, until even the musicians, who had been tuning, lowered their instruments. "The heiress of Lyon," the herald said again, more softly, because the room no longer required volume. Eleanora stepped through the door. She did not look at the second fireplace. She did not need to. She felt the moment her husband saw her, because the silence around him changed shape. She walked down the long, bright gallery alone, and the gown moved the way she had paid the seamstress to make it move, the river stone gray turning at every step to that faint thread of silver, and the single seam of pale gold along the bodice caught the chandelier light exactly as she had been promised it would. And across the room, to the eyes of those who had been waiting all year to know what the heiress of Lyon looked like, she read as a line of light walking. The king met her at the dais, although by every protocol he should have stayed upon it. He took her hand. He turned with her to the room. He spoke, and his voice carried in the way of voices trained from boyhood to carry. And he said the things one says on such an occasion: the gratitude of the crown, the gratitude of the hospital, the gratitude of the choir, the gratitude of the fishermen on the lower coast who, he said, with a small smile that the room loved him for, had sent a barrel of salt to the palace as their contribution to tonight's table. The room laughed, gently, and was glad to laugh, because the silence had been heavy and laughter was a way of putting it down. And then the king said her name. He said it as her father's daughter. He said it without title, without husband, without house. He said, "Eleanora of Lyon," and he said it as if it were a sentence complete in itself. From the second fireplace there came no sound at all. Eleanora did not look. She inclined her head to the king. She thanked the room in 3 sentences she had written in the carriage and rewritten in her head, and now found that she did not need, because the room was no longer listening to words. The room was looking at her. She let it look. She had earned, she thought, a moment of being looked at. She stepped down from the dais. The musicians, having recovered themselves, began the first measure of the opening dance, and a young lord, whom she did not know, but who had clearly been instructed in advance, bowed before her and offered his hand. And she danced one figure with him, and one with an old admiral who had served her father, and one with a boy of perhaps 14 who had been brought to court for the first time and who blushed so violently when she accepted that she liked him at once. She did not dance with her husband. He did not ask. He stood instead, near the second fireplace, and for the first time in 7 years, she watched him not knowing what to do with his hands. Lady Cassia, to her credit, recovered quickly. Lady Cassia smiled a smile that did not quite reach the eyes, and said something low and bright into his ear that made him nod too many times, and detached herself from his arm with a grace Eleanora respected even as she pitied it, and moved across the room to the windows, where she stood for a long moment looking out at nothing. Eleanora, between dances, found herself beside her. Neither of them had planned it. The window was deep and the curtain was heavy, and for a length of perhaps 8 breaths, They were as private as two women could be in such a room. Cassia did not turn. Cassia said, in a voice pitched only for the glass, "You knew." Eleonora said, "I knew." Cassia said, "Since when?" Eleonora said, "Since the second week." Cassia was quiet for the length of 2 more breaths. Then she said, very low, "He told me you were a fool." Eleonora said, "He tells everyone that. It is how he forgives himself." Cassia laughed, once, without sound. Cassia said, "I am sorry, you know." Eleonora said, "I do not think you are, yet. But you will be. And I am not the one you will owe the apology to." Cassia turned her head, finally, and looked at her. She had the kind of eyes that had learned to make decisions quickly. She said, "What will you do?" Eleonora said, "What I have already done." She inclined her head to Cassia with a courtesy that was not warm, but was not cold, and she walked away from the window, and Cassia did not follow her. The dance changed. The room shifted. The Duke of Marchcombe, who had spent the last quarter hour attempting to compose his face, crossed the floor toward his wife. He moved as a man moves who is choosing each step in advance because he does not trust the next one. He bowed. He said, in a voice meant only for her, "Eleonora." He had not, she realized, said her name aloud in 11 months. She inclined her head. She said, "Your Grace." He said, "You might have told me." She said, "I might have." He said, "Why did you not?" She said, "Because you did not ask." He stood for a moment as if he had been struck. Then he said, more quietly, "Will you dance with me?" She looked at him. He had been beautiful at 23, and she had loved that beauty. And she had grown up, and the beauty had not. There were small lines at the corner of his mouth she had not seen before, because she had not, in some time, allowed herself to look. He looked, she thought, tired. She said, "No, Sebastian, not tonight." He flinched. He covered it well. He said, "Then will you walk with me?" She said, "In a little while." He bowed. He stepped back. He did not return to the second fireplace. The supper room of Astron had been laid for 400, and the salt from the lower coast was, by the king's order, on every table in a small dish of plain pottery beside the gilded ones, which was the kind of joke the king made when he wished to be remembered as a man of taste, and which the court, who understood him, appreciated without saying so. Eleonora sat at the king's left, which was the place that had been written on the card 3 weeks ago by a hand she did not know but trusted. Across from her, 3 seats down, sat her husband. Between them sat the Bishop of Welt, who was old and deaf and an excellent dinner companion, because he assumed every smile was meant for him, and was usually right. The bishop told her a long story about a horse he had once owned that had refused to cross bridges, and she laughed in the proper places and ate very little, and watched her husband watch her without seeming to. He had been seated, by some careful malice or careful kindness she could not yet name, beside Lady Cassia, who had recovered her composure entirely, and was eating with the small pretty appetite of a woman who had decided that the only available dignity was to behave as if nothing had happened. They did not speak to each other. They spoke with great determination to the people on their other sides. Sebastian had been given, on his right, an elderly marchioness who was famously talkative and famously hard of hearing, and Eleonora, who had not arranged the seating but had been consulted on it, allowed herself, for the length of 1 heartbeat, a small private smile. The king saw it. The king did not comment. The king said, instead, in the easy tone he used when he wished to seem to be speaking only of bread, that he had heard the heiress of Lyon was considering establishing a school in the lower coast for the daughters of fishermen, and that he wondered, idly, where she had found the time. Eleonora said, "Your Majesty, a woman who is not asked her opinion has a great deal of time." The king laughed into his cup. The bishop, who had not heard, laughed too, on principle. Across the table, her husband heard. He set down his glass with a care that suggested he no longer trusted his hand. After supper, there were speeches. After speeches, there were toasts. After toasts, the room moved again into the great gallery, and the music began once more, but more slowly now, the older measures, the ones that allowed for conversation between figures. Eleonora found, at last, that she could not put it off any longer. She walked, alone, toward the small library that opened off the gallery, and she paused at the door, and she felt, rather than saw, her husband detach himself from the fireplace and follow her. The library was empty. A single lamp burned on the long table. The shelves rose into shadow. Behind her, the door clicked shut. He said her name. She turned. He had taken off his gloves. He held them in one hand, twisting them, which was a thing he had done as a boy and had broken himself of, and which he was, she saw, doing again. He said, "I did not know." She said, "I am aware." He said, "You let me think." She said, "Yes, I let you think. I let you think because thinking was what you preferred to looking." He flinched. He said, "That is not fair." She said, "It is exactly fair, Sebastian, and you know it." He was quiet. Then he said, more quietly than she had heard him speak in years, "What will you do?" She said, "I have already done it." She lifted the small embroidered reticule from her wrist. She drew from it the folded sheet of cream paper, sealed in plain wax, addressed in her own hand to Mr. Halloran of Carrick Street. She did not open it. She did not need to. She said, "By tomorrow noon, this letter will have done 3 things. It will have transferred the lease of Marchcombe House, which I bought back from the bank 4 years ago without your knowledge, into a trust whose beneficiaries are the orphan choir on Drover Lane, the hospital on Drover Lane, and the school I am about to build on the lower coast. It will have settled upon you a yearly allowance sufficient for a gentleman to live in dignity in a smaller house, which I have already taken for you in Welt. And it will have begun, through the proper church courts, the quiet process by which a woman who has been publicly humiliated by her husband may, with the consent of the crown and the blessing of the bishop, untie the knot she did not, in the end, tie." He sat down. There was a chair behind him. He found it by feel, the way a man finds a chair in the dark. He said, after a long moment, "The house." She said, "The house was never yours, Sebastian. Your father lost it in the year I was 19. My father bought it back for me as part of my dowry, on the condition that I never tell you, because he believed it would have killed your father's pride. Your father is dead. Your pride, I have decided, will survive." He put his face in his hands. He did not weep. He had never wept easily. He sat there with his face in his hands, and Eleonora watched him, and she felt, for the first time that night, something very close to the grief she had been refusing all day. She let it come. She let it stay for the length of one slow breath. Then she set it down. She said more gently, "Sebastian, I am not punishing you." He looked up. His eyes were red but dry. He said, "It feels like punishment." She said, "I know. I am sorry that it does, but I am 31 years old, and I have been your wife for 7 years, and I have been alone in this marriage for 5 of them, and tonight you brought another woman into a house I have paid for and asked me to stand beside it and smile. He said I did not know it was yours. She said, That is the point, Sebastian. You did not know any of it was mine. He was quiet. Then he said, What about Kasia? She said, That is between you and Kasia, and it is no longer my concern. I would only suggest, as someone who has paid a great deal of attention to her this evening, that she is a more intelligent woman than you have given her credit for, and that if you intend to keep her, you will have to begin by asking her what she actually wants. He nodded. It was a small, defeated nod. It was, she thought, the first true thing he had done in a long time. She said, I will leave you a moment. I will be in the gallery when you are ready to come out. She moved to the door. At the door, she paused. She did not turn. She said, Sebastian? He said, Yes. She said, I did love you. For a while. I want you to know that. He said, in a voice she barely heard, I know. She opened the door. She stepped through. She closed it gently behind her. In the gallery, the dance had shifted to a slow old measure that her grandmother had loved, and Eleonora stood at the edge of the floor for a moment and let the music do for her what the river had done on the road. She breathed. She counted, without meaning to, the candles in the nearest chandelier. 36. She had always counted things. Her father had counted things. It was, perhaps, the only thing of his she had not had to teach herself. The king caught her eye across the room and inclined his head in a small private question, and she answered it with the smallest possible smile, which was as much as either of them was willing to risk in public. And he turned back to the ambassador he had been pretending to listen to with the relief of a man who had been waiting for permission. Lady Kasia was no longer at the window. Lady Kasia was, Eleonora saw with a flicker of surprise, in the far corner of the gallery, speaking with a young woman in dove gray who was the daughter of the Lyon family's chief solicitor and who had no business being at this ball except that Eleonora had arranged for her to be. The young woman was listening. Kasia was speaking quickly and quietly. Eleonora watched them for the length of 3 breaths and then looked away, because to watch longer would have been to interfere, and she had decided already that whatever Kasia made of this night would be Kasia's to make. A small boy in livery, perhaps 10, appeared at her elbow with a folded paper on a tray. She took it. She read it. It was from the king. It said only, in a hand that was famously bad, When you are ready to go, the small carriage with the green lamps in the eastern court is yours, and the road through the park is open. She refolded the paper. She gave the boy a coin he did not expect, and a smile he would remember for the rest of his life. And she went, not yet, to find her cloak, but to make the round of farewells that a woman of her position owed to a room that had just learned her name. She spoke to the admiral who had served her father, and he kissed her hand and said, in the gruff way of old sailors, Your father would have wept, my lady. Anne would have pretended he had not. She spoke to the matron of the hospital on Drover Lane, who had been brought to the ball for the first time in her life, and who was wearing a borrowed gown and a real smile, and she promised her the second well by spring. She spoke to the printer's apprentice, who was not in fact at the ball, but to his master, who was, and who took her hand in both of his ink-stained ones and said, My lady, the boy will be a great man. She spoke to the Bishop of Welt, who heard perhaps half of what she said, and blessed her for all of it. She spoke, last, to the young woman in dove gray, who curtsied very deeply and said quietly, The Lady Kasia has asked me to convey to you her thanks. Eleonora said, For what? The young woman said she did not say. She said only that you would understand. Eleonora considered this. Then she said, Please tell the Lady Kasia that I do, and that I wish her well, and that the offer I made her at the window stands." The young woman blinked. She did not ask. She inclined her head. She moved away. Eleanora found her cloak in the antechamber where she had spoken to the king. The man in the dark green coat was there again, and he bowed her into the slate-gray wool with the careful tenderness of a man dressing a daughter for cold weather. He said, "My lady, the king wishes you to know that he will write to you in the morning." She said, "Please tell His Majesty I will be at Carrick Street by noon and at home in the afternoon." He bowed. She walked through the small door, down the lamplit passage, and out into the eastern court, where a carriage stood with green lamps burning low at its corners, and a coachman she did not know touching his hat to her without ceremony. She did not look back at the palace. She did not need to. She had walked through it once and out of it once, and that was enough. She stepped into the carriage. The door closed. The horses moved. The carriage rolled out through the eastern gate and into the park, where the road ran under old trees and the lamps grew sparser and the stars came back. She did not weep in the carriage. She had thought perhaps that she might. She did not. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the trees go by, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not, in fact, lost anything tonight. She had only set down a thing she had been carrying for a very long time. She had been carrying it so long she had forgotten its weight. Now she remembered. Now she understood that she had been tired. Not unhappy, only tired, in the particular way of a person who has been holding her breath for years. She breathed. The carriage carried her home along the river, and the river, indifferent and knowing as a river is, kept her company the whole way. The house she went to was not Marchcombe House. The house she went to was a small one she had bought 4 years ago in the quieter part of the city, on a street called Halberd Row, where the houses were narrow and the windows had window boxes, and the neighbors were a retired music master, a midwife, and a clockmaker whose shop sign was a single painted moon. The house had 3 rooms downstairs and 4 upstairs, and a small walled garden at the back with a pear tree that had been planted before she was born. She had told no one she owned it, except Tibby, who had been quietly furnishing it for the last 3 years with the patience of a woman building a nest for a bird who did not yet know she was a bird. The carriage stopped at the corner because the street was too narrow for it. Eleanora stepped down. The coachman touched his hat. The coachman drove on. She stood for a moment on the cobbles in her gray gown under the street lamp, and she thought she had perhaps never in her life been so alone. And she found, examining the thought, that she did not mind. She walked the length of Halberd Row. She fit the key into the door of the 3rd house from the end. The door opened. Inside, a single lamp had been lit, and a fire had been laid in the small front room, and on the table beside the fire was a covered dish that smelled of bread, and a pot of tea wrapped in a cloth, and a note in Tibby's careful, ungrammatical hand that said only, "Eat, my lady, and sleep." Tibby herself was, Eleanora knew, asleep upstairs in the small bedroom at the back, because Tibby had been a step ahead of her for 2 decades and saw no reason to fall behind tonight. Eleanora unhooked her cloak. She hung it on the peg. She unhooked the gold seam of her bodice and let it ease. She sat in the chair beside the fire, and she ate the bread, and she drank the tea, and she watched the fire for a long while. The pear tree outside the back window moved a little in the wind. The clock on the mantel, which Tibby had wound, ticked. She did not weep. She felt, instead, the quiet release of a thing she had not known she was waiting for. It broke quietly. She let it break. After a time she rose. She climbed the narrow stair. She found the room Tibby had prepared for her, with white linen and a small vase of late summer roses from the walled garden, and she lay down in her gown because she did not want, tonight, to be alone with her body, and she slept the kind of sleep one sleeps after one has finally set down a heavy thing. In the morning, she would go to Carrick Street. In the morning, she would meet Mr. Halloran. In the morning, she would begin the long, careful, irrevocable business of being herself in public. Tonight she slept in a small house on a narrow street, under a pear tree she had been waiting for years to listen to. The morning came in pale and slow, the way mornings come in a city that has stayed up too late. Eleanor awoke before Tibby, which was unusual, and she stood at the window of her small bedroom in her gray gown and watched the light find the pear tree, leaf by leaf. She thought, as she watched, about a number of small things. She thought about the king, who had been kind, and about the king's wife, whom she had not seen at the ball, but who had, she knew, sent her a private gift the week before that she had not yet opened. She thought about Cassia at the window, and about the young woman in dove gray, and about the offer she had made and the answer she had received without words. She thought about Sebastian in the library with his face in his hands. She thought about the orphan choir on Drover Lane and the boy who had set the type for his own hymn. She thought, more than anything, about the long, unspectacular work that lay ahead. The kind of work that did not earn ballrooms. The kind one did because one had said one would. She washed, she dressed with Tibby's help, in a plainer gown the color of weak tea and a coat the color of bark. And she ate the bread Tibby brought her, and she walked, because the day was fine and the streets were quiet, to Carrick Street. Mr. Halloran was a small, thin man with bright eyes and ink on his cuffs, and the particular calm of a man who had been keeping other people's secrets for 40 years. He rose when she entered. He bowed. He did not waste her time. He read the letter. He nodded once. He said, "My lady, by noon." She thanked him. She did not stay. She walked, by long, slow streets she had not walked in years, back across the city to Marchcombe House, where she had one more conversation to have. She had it in the small parlor where they had once, in the first year, played chess together. Sebastian came down. He had not slept. He had washed and shaved and put on a plain coat, which was, she understood, a kind of effort. He stood at the window. She sat. They spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour. He did not argue. He had not the heart for it. He asked, at one point, whether she would mind if he kept the hunting dog, which was a question so unexpected and so small that she laughed before she could stop herself. And he laughed too, briefly, the first real laugh between them in years. And they did not laugh again. But the laugh had been there, and it mattered. He asked about Kasia. She said, "That is yours to ask Kasia." He nodded. He said, "Will you ever come back to this house?" She said, "No, Sebastian." He nodded again. He said, "Will you write to me?" She said, "On occasion." About the children, if there are any. He looked up, surprised. She said, "You are still a young man." He said, more quietly than she expected, "Yes." She rose. He rose. He did not offer his hand, and she did not offer hers. But at the door she paused, and she said, "Sebastian, look after the housekeeper. She has served this house for 40 years, and she will not ask for anything." He said, "I will." She said, "I have made arrangements for her in any case, but it would be a kindness if she did not know." He said, "I will not tell her." She said, "Thank you." She left the room. She left the house. She did not look back at the painting of the old queen above the staircase, which she had loved, and which would not, she had arranged, leave the house when she did. The house was no longer hers in any sense that mattered. It belonged now to the trust, and the trust belonged to the orphan choir and the hospital and the school. And the school did not yet exist, but it would. She walked home along the river. The river kept her company again. She thought, as she walked, about a thing her father had said to her once that she had not understood at the time. He had said, "The test of a life is not what you build, daughter, but what you let go of cleanly." She had been 12. She had not understood. She understood now. By the end of the month, the city would know. By the end of the season, the bishop would have signed the papers, and the king would have countersigned them, and she would, in the eyes of the law and the church and the gossip of every drawing room from the palace to the lower coast, be a single woman again, in possession of her own name and her own ledger and her own house on Halberd Row. By the end of the year, the school on the lower coast would have its foundations dug. By the end of the next year, there would be a roof. By the year after, there would be girls in the rooms learning to read a ledger before they learned to dance, because the heiress of Lyon had decided that this, more than anything else she might do, would be the work of the second half of her life. And the rest, as the storyteller is bound to tell you, was as follows. Sebastian, Duke of Marchcombe, took the smaller house in Velt and, against the general expectation of the city, did very well in it. He kept the dog. He learned, by degrees, to ask a woman what she wanted before he told her what he intended. He did not marry Lady Cassia, because Lady Cassia, with a clarity that surprised everyone except Eleonora, declined him in a letter so polite and so final that he framed it in later years beside his desk as a reminder. He married instead a widow of moderate fortune and considerable patience, whom he met at a county assembly when he was 36, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And the girl, by her own request, was sent at the age of 9 to the school on the lower coast for a year, because her father said it was the best in the kingdom, and her mother, who had read the prospectus, agreed. Lady Cassia accepted, the week after the ball, a position Eleonora had quietly arranged for her, as the manager of the bookshop on Carrick Street that the Lion Foundation had bought for the orphan choir to sell its printed hymns from, and she ran it with such a combination of charm and ruthlessness that within 4 years, it was the most profitable bookshop in the city, and within 7, she had bought it from the foundation outright, at a price they negotiated over tea. And she never married, and was famously good company, and was known, in the last years of her life, as the only person in the kingdom who could make the heiress of Lyon laugh until she had to sit down. The Bishop of Welt, who outlived everyone's expectations, including his own, signed the papers, blessed the school, and ate, at the opening, 3 plates of fish from the lower coast and pronounced them excellent. The king wrote, as he had promised, the next morning, and continued to write on the 1st of every month for the rest of his life. And his letters were kept in a box in the front room of the house on Halberd Row, and were burned, by Eleonora's own instruction, the day after his funeral, because she said that some friendships were not meant to be read by strangers. The boy who had set the type for his own hymn became, in time, a printer of some renown, and the press he founded printed, among many other things, the first reading primers for the school on the lower coast. The matron of the hospital got her second well by spring, and a third one the spring after, and lived to see clean water in every ward. The housekeeper at Marchcombe House, who had served 40 years, was found, after her quiet retirement, to have been left a small pension and a cottage by an anonymous benefactor, and she lived in the cottage for 11 years with a cat called Admiral and a window box of marigolds, and she did not, until the day she died, learn whose kindness it had been, though she had her suspicions and kept them, like a good housekeeper, to herself. Tibby stayed. Of course Tibby stayed. Tibby ran the house on Halberd Row with the same quiet competence she had run every other house, and she lived to be 81, and she was buried, by her own request, in the small churchyard at the end of the row, under a stone Eleonora chose, on which were carved only her name, her dates, and the words "She fed me." And Eleonora, the heiress of Lyon, became, over the years, one of those figures a city quietly organizes itself around without quite knowing it has done so. A woman whose name appeared in no portrait gallery and on no public plaque, and yet whose hand was, if you knew where to look, on the lintel of half the doorways that mattered. And she lived, for many years, in the small house with the pear tree, and she walked, every fine morning, by the river that had kept her company on the night of the ball, and she counted, sometimes, without meaning to, the small things that made up a life that had at last become her own. And there, by the fire, the story rests. If you have ever been seen sideways in your own life, kept small in a room you yourself were holding up, loved less than the work of your hands would have earned in a fairer world, then you have stood for a moment in Eleonora's slate gray gown, and you know what it is to walk down a long, bright gallery with a thread of gold at your bodice and no one's arm but your own. I wonder, you and I, here in the warm of this hour, which moment stayed with you? Was it the laugh in the courtyard that did not come a second time? Was it the king's hand, warm and a little rough, lifting her up from her curtsy? Was it Cassia at the window saying, very low, you knew? Was it Sebastian in the library, twisting his gloves like a boy? Was it the pear tree, moving a little in the wind outside the back window of a small house she had been quietly preparing for years to come home to? Tell me, when you sit down again by your own fire, which line you carried out with you? And if you found, in tonight's telling, a kind of company you would like to keep, draw your chair a little closer, settle your hands, and stay with me. There will be another story when the wood has been turned and the kettle has been filled. Another quiet life unfolded by this small light. Another underestimated heart finally, gently, seen. The fire will be here. The chair will be here. I will be here. Sleep well, friend. Sleep well.